Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another installment of the book of Exodus. I'm waiting for my slides to come up. Well, while we're doing that, let me go ahead and recap what we've been looking over the last week. And as of today, we got 3 more Sundays, and we got a lot of chapters to go through. But fortunately, some of the material we're covering today, we can go pretty briefly. There's not a lot of theology in there. But last week, we finished up looking at the crossing of the Red Sea, and then as a victory celebration, we read about the Song of Moses and the Song of Miriam. And then in chapter 16, we read where the Lord provides manna, and He also provided meat in the form of quail. We also read about the very first mention of the Sabbath day. In chapter 17, we read about water from the rock, and I showed you an actual split rock in northwestern Saudi Arabia, which is probably the site where that actually happened, and there's some evidence to indicate that. We have the battle against the Amalekites, their very first battle since they left Egypt. Already they were thrown into the battle. And then chapter 18 was pretty much all about Jethro. Jethro brings Zipporah, who's Moses' wife, and his 2 sons, Gershon and Merari. And then Jethro gives wise counsel to Moses, basically delegating authority as far as judging and so on. And that gets us now to chapter 19, which I gave you just a brief preview last Sunday about what we're going to look at. Chapter 19, we read that Moses and the Israelites arrive at Mount Sinai. And so, let's see, I'm supposed to have something where, there we go, where when God split the Red Sea, now granted, I understand there's different theories, I've already told you that, but me personally, from what I've read, I think this is one of the most likely areas where they cross from the Nueva beach over to the other side, and it may have looked pretty much like that. And then you see Jethro's home in modern day Al-Bad is the name of the city now. It's like an oasis town. And then where I think the possible site of Mount Sinai is modern day Jabal Machlah. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Israel arrives at Mount Sinai 3 months after departing Egypt. And it would kind of make sense, wouldn't it, that it's got to be somewhere near Midian. I think about the traditional site of Mount Sinai, right in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula. And think about it, if Jethro was in Midian, he's living in northwestern Saudi, what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. And where I've circled down the bottom of the chart there, we have Jethro's home. Most likely, it's like one of the very few places that had any water. In fact, when I did some studying on this, there is a well there in Al-Bad. It's called, in English, it'd be called the Well of Moses. Well, why would they call it the Well of Moses? Because they understand that's where he came, or at least that's where they believe it did. And it makes sense, doesn't it, that if Moses is working for Jethro, shepherding the sheep, that he's probably going to be within maybe several miles of that area. I can't imagine him wandering off too far, but can you imagine if the place that he saw the burning bush, well, we know it was Mount Sinai, but why would Moses leave that location, northwestern Saudi Arabia, go all the way around the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, and then go like halfway to Egypt to shepherd Jethro's sheep? That's just a really long way. So that part of it just doesn't make sense to me. This makes much more sense and I'll have a few more comments here. But anyway, let me just make some comments. Well, you notice sometimes Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb are used interchangeably. There's some speculation that one may refer to like the mountain peak, the other may be a range. Nobody seems to understand exactly, but it does seem to be synonymous with Mount Horeb. For example, in Exodus 3:1, we have the first reference to Mount Horeb, and it seems to be interchangeable, Sinai. And then later in 3:12, it's also called Mount Horeb. And Malachi 4:4 refers to Mount Horeb. But in the context, it seems like it's talking about Mount Sinai. So I think they're probably much the same. Interestingly, Paul says that Mount Sinai is in Arabia in Galatians 4:25. Now, full disclosure here, although even though he says it's Arabia, in ancient times, the location of Arabia may have included areas beyond what we now call the Arabian Peninsula. Nowadays, when we think of Arabia, we kind of think of it more like the Arabian Peninsula. So they may have a broader view, so it's possible it may have been beyond that, but I think it kind of makes sense to me because where modern day, where the traditional view of Mount Sinai is, I think could be considered a part of Egyptian territory and not Arabia. And also, just this is something I couldn't prove, but I just have a hunch that, Paul was a very devout Jew, very, very devout. We know that prior to his conversion to Christianity. And it would, anyway, I've wondered maybe that when Paul was converted, that must have been quite a shock to him. It must have been a real disturbance, and I think he spent some time just, I think, sorting things through, trying to readjust his life. And just me personally, I'm kind of thinking I wouldn't be surprised if maybe back then they knew where Mount Sinai was, and I could see him going to Arabia and going to doing a little soul searching down there, thinking about what is this new situation in his life meaning, before he was really ready to become the Apostle Paul that we know today. But again, that's just speculation on my part, but it seems to be consistent. Because we do read, after his conversion, Paul did travel to Arabia, Galatians 1:17. So there's two mentions of Arabia in connection with Paul. So it kind of makes sense to me. Now, the traditional location, what we call Mount Sinai, I'm not sure, it's kind of maybe a chicken and the egg thing. I'm not sure why they call it Mount Sinai, maybe because they believe that's where Mount Sinai was, so they call it the Sinai Peninsula. But the actual mountain is called Jabal Musa, which means Mount of Moses, because that's where they think, many people thought where it was, and there's St. Catherine's Monastery that's built there. Now, from what I've read, there's some other speculation, but I think more likely it's this Jabal Maqla that you see on the eastern part of the chart. Jabal Maqla means burnt mountain. Burnt mountain. It's in northwestern Saudi Arabia. And when you see a picture of it, I'll have a picture coming up, you'll see why. It's blackened at the top. And not only is the location consistent with all the other events, but think about it, there's no other mountain in that area that has a blackened top, as if it's been burnt. And you may recall in the story of Exodus, and we're going to talk about that God appeared to Moses and the Israelites they said the top of the mountain was burning, and there was smoke coming from the mountain. So I found a website that's totally dedicated just to this mountain, and you have geologists that are speculating. Some think that maybe the blackened was because of some burning. Some say no, it's some kind of rock or something. But interestingly enough, it's only the surface that's burnt. It's not the inner rock. So it's almost like it was burnt from the outside, like there was a fire, but it's not like the entire rock was burnt like deep inside the earth. So that's kind of interesting. And the mountain is 21 miles northeast of Jethro's settlement, which is modern-day Al-Bad in Saudi Arabia. You can go home and look it up and read about it. And so 21 miles, that would be a little reasonable. If you're Moses and you're shepherding the flocks, maybe you had a lot of flocks, I could see back then maybe somebody could wander 20 to 30 miles away perhaps to shepherd the flocks, but they're not going to go hundreds of miles to the west through barren territory to shepherd sheep. They'd probably kill the sheep, if you did something like that, unless you do it really slowly. Also, Jabal Maqla is one of the tallest mountains in northwestern Saudi Arabia, and it lies within a mountain range called the Midian Mountains. Well, because that is the land of Midian, and it makes just sense to me that the mountain that Moses went up on the burning bush, where he also received the Ten Commandments, would be somewhere in the land of Midian, somewhere near where Jethro lived. And the elevation, I said, it was one of the highest. It's 7,630 feet above sea level. Now, I've been talking about where I think it is, but when you get right down to it, what happened there is a lot more important than where it is. So it's okay if we have a different point of view on where it is. But what happened there is much more important. Also, what happened is more important than when it happened, even though it's kind of nice to be able to pin it down. In verses 5 through 6 of 19, God said, "If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And it's interesting, that phrase, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We see that Israel, ancient Israel, is a type of the church. And when we say type, we mean like a forerunner or a predecessor in a way, or a foreshadowing. This idea of Israel, it foreshadows the church as a holy nation. In 1 Peter 2:9, he paraphrases these words. He says of people who are followers of Christ today, he said, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." In Revelation 1:6, Jesus Christ has made us into a kingdom, priests to God and Father. In Revelation 5, verses 9 through 10, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders sang a new song before the Christ, saying, "You purchased people for God with your blood from every tribe, language, people, and nation. You have made them into a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth." So this is borrowed right out of the language of Exodus. And as I go through Exodus, I'm just so impressed with how many references there are in the New Testament to Exodus. In particular, I think after reading the book of Exodus, and to some extent Leviticus, next time you read the book of Hebrews, I think it'll be much more enriching for you. I think you'll really get a lot more out of it if you understand this. Well, here's a picture of Jabal Machlah in northwestern Saudi Arabia, in what used to be in the land of ancient Midian. And the Lord visits Mount Sinai here. This is discussed in verse 18 to 25. We read about their smoke and fire. Smoke and fire. And you can see the top third of this mountain is blackened as if it has been burnt. In verse 19, there's also the trumpet and the thunder. Verse 20 through 22, the voice of God. In verses 21 through 25, God sets a boundary, and he tells, don't let the people come up in the mountain. It'll be fatal to them. They're not allowed up here. And I want to read something from verses 22 and then 24 about the priests. Verse 22 says, "Also, have the priests who approach the Lord consecrate themselves, or else the Lord will break out against them." Verse 24, "Then the Lord said to him, Go down and come up again, you and Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them." Now, interestingly enough, this is the first mention of priests, and this is prior to the formal establishment of the Levitical priesthood. Now, I don't know if there was already some kind of priestly activity going on, or maybe this is in anticipation that certain men would eventually become the Levitical priests. It's kind of hard to say. But I thought it was interesting. The very first mention of priests, even though Aaron and his sons have not been commissioned or ordained yet as priests. Probably just about everybody here can recognize this person. And in chapter 20, probably what we've all been waiting for is the giving of the Ten Commandments. Now, a lot of people, they make a big deal about the Ten Commandments, and I don't want to minimize them at all, but they talk almost like that's the only thing that God ordained. 10 Commandments, that's the only rules we have. And you'll find that beginning in chapter 20, you go several chapters on, there's a lot more regulations and laws that have been put out by the Ten Commandments. But the Ten Commandments are just sort of like a baseline. And just to show you the relevance, if you lived in Oklahoma long enough, or probably anywhere, you know that to this day, that still is an issue. Like I remember a few years ago, I think there was an issue about whether they should put up the Ten Commandments, like a monument to the Ten Commandments on the state capitol. Does anybody remember that? And also in public school classrooms, it seems like periodically some school district wants to put in the Ten Commandments in every room. And some people don't like that because they feel like it's promoting religion, even though, whatever your view is, it is part of history, right? It definitely has affected the Western world and culture, and it's the foundation behind our laws today. Even if you don't, even if you're not particularly religious, it still has cultural significance, if nothing else. But that tells you that thousands and thousands of years later, the Ten Commandments are still relevant. They're still controversial to this day, if you think about it. And that reminds me of something else I want to share with you. Think about all the sermons you've heard in your life. I'll bet you most of them you probably don't remember the details of them, but I have to say there are a few sermons that I've heard in my life that for whatever reason, they stuck with me for decades. And there's one that I remember back when I was in Waukesha, Wisconsin. I used to go to church there. And the preacher, Larry Bertram, he gave a sermon one day about the Ten Commandments. And usually when a lot of people approach the Ten Commandments, they think of it as sort of almost a negative light. They think about all these things you can't do. And they think of it as very negative, like thou shalt not this, and thou shalt, and I think people outside the church, they probably think like, wow, being a Christian can't be any fun. You just can't, because it's like all these things you can't do, and it's all very negative. And Larry, when he gave his sermon, he turned it upside down. Now, I don't remember the details, but I just remember the general concept. I was so impressed with it. He presented the Ten Commandments not as 10 limitations and restrictions, but really as 10 guidelines to freedom. He turned it right around and said that actually, if you follow the Ten Commandments, you're free. You are liberated. You have a big weight off your shoulders. If you think about it, if people all over the world, they would just adhere to the principles of the Ten Commandments, then the world will be a whole lot better place, wouldn't it? If everybody put God first, if everybody loved their neighbor, if everybody would not steal and covet and commit adultery and so on and so forth, this world will be a whole lot better place. And so how we actually presented that, I don't remember the details, but the concept I thought was great, that he presented as rules of freedom, that they're actually liberating if you follow that. And so I thought that was pretty neat. The Ten Commandments. And I know there was another point I was going to make, and now it just escaped me, but maybe we'll get to that later. So let's go ahead and get into the actual commandments are listed here. I just have the short version of it. You shall have no other gods before me. God will not abide anything else vying for our worship, adoration, attention. And it's not just idols, but there's even good things that can get in the way of God. I've heard stories where people are maybe engaged in beneficial things, trying to do God's work, but ultimately get so obsessed with certain activities that they get in the way. We don't want anything like that to happen. Number 2, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them nor serve them. And that's pretty straightforward. Kind of goes with the first one. Number 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. In other words, you shall not misuse the name of God or use the name of God lightly. This prohibited using God's name for insincere, frivolous, or fraudulent purposes or in any irreverent way. So I know every time, whenever I'm about to say something about God or like maybe say something funny, I have to pause and I'm saying, what I'm about to say, is it going to like make fun of God, or is it going to maybe take God light? Like if I knew God were standing right next to me, which in a way he is, if I thought Jesus or God were standing right next to me, would I say that now? Would I say it in the way I would? So I just, think about those things. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Well, it doesn't mean you're not supposed to do nothing all day. It doesn't mean you're just supposed to sit on the couch and not do anything at all. But it's meant to be, excuse me, I'm sorry. But it's meant to be a day of spiritual service on which God's people focused on him and worshiped him. And also, it makes it clear that God really did create the entire universe in 6 literal days, because there are several references in the New Testament that corroborate this. Instead of saying, well, here's what really happened, or here's what God really meant when he said this, but it just really stands it up there, I think. Number 5, honor your father and your mother so that your days may be prolonged on the land which the Lord your God gives you. Well, this longevity refers to Israel's duration as a nation in a covenant relationship to God. But it also conveys the general principle that if you esteem your parents, that's going to contribute to a longer life. Generally, where you are now, they've been there before. They've learned about life. They have wisdom, and if you follow the guidelines, generally, you'll be better off. So I think that's the point of view. By the way, these 10 commandments, I believe that every one of them in some way is referred to in the New Testament. Every one of them. Like this, I remember like just verse 5. I mean, I know the 5th commandment, I know that's repeated in the New Testament for sure. Number 6, you shall not murder. Later, the law distinguished between murder and accidental killing in chapter 21. Number 7, you shall not commit adultery. God instituted the marriage relationship between one man and one woman. Now, since then, people have come up with variations on that theme, but they have to use their imagination to do that, because that is what God ordained, and there's no other kind of intimate romantic relationship between individuals other than one man and one woman. And don't get angry at me, because it's not my opinion, all right? That's what God said. You can take it up with him if you disagree. Jesus applied this command of sexual morality even to our thoughts as well as our deeds. Matthew 5:27 through 28, which if you think about it, it's, I think the Israelites had this idea that I can think whatever I want as long as I don't actually do it. But remember, God is a spiritual being, and our mind, that's part of God's spirit. We're made in his likeness. And so the things that we think, God can see what we think, even though we can't see what other people are thinking. But God can see what we're thinking. And that's very challenging. It's one thing, we probably have all kinds of thoughts. There's probably things that we would like to do, but we say, no, I probably shouldn't do that. And I don't mean just adultery, but just anything. Maybe we're angry about something, want to do something, but we say, no, I better not do that. But God, if you nip it in the bud, if you can just stop the thought in the first place. Well, anyway, the marriage relationship is also used as a model for God's relationship with his people, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. As far as the New Testament, you go to Ephesians 5, we read about the relationship between the husband and the wife, but it's comparing that to the church's relationship to Jesus. And then also in Revelation chapters 19, 21, and 22, it talks about the bride of Christ, and Christ is the groom, and so on. Moving on to number 8, you shall not steal. This is closely related to the 10th commandment, not to covet. And it's not limited to property, but it also includes even kidnapping people. That's addressed in 21:16. And there's different ways to steal. One way, obviously, you take something out of somebody's house, or you take something that belongs to somebody else. But it can also apply to soft forms of stealing. For example, maybe you cheat on your income tax. That's kind of relevant this time of year. Maybe you're misusing company supplies. Maybe you're pocketing stuff from the company. Maybe you're just loafing on the job, and those kind of things. Those are maybe indirect or soft forms of stealing. Number 9, you should not give false testimony against your neighbor. This commandment was especially important under Israelite law, since many crimes had stiff punishments, including death. Now think about it. Since a case could be decided on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, it was vital to make sure that false testimony was not offered in court, thereby resulting in someone's wrongful punishment. So you really needed people who were honest, because somebody's life could hang in the balance based on the testimony of a witness. And then the last one is, you shall not covet. Now all of them, of all the 10 commandments, this is the most inward of the 10 commandments. Because again, it doesn't necessarily mean you're acting on that, but it's what's in your heart, it's what you're thinking. James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15 talks about that. He uses the term lusting, and it starts in your heart, and then eventually it leads to sin and death. Now, there are several examples of things his people were not to covet. For example, in this 10th commandment, he says you're not supposed to covet your neighbor's house, his wife, his servant, his utility animals, and it's not limited to just these. It's like, so I can covet against other things as long as I don't covet these. It doesn't really work that way. It's such things as this. Really, to summarize, God made a general statement that his people were not to covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. He simply gave you some examples. So in summary, I've got a one-word summary of each of the 10 commandments. You ready for this? Okay. I got God, idols, name, Sabbath, parents, murder, adultery, steal, lie, covet. There you have, one-word summary. Now, if I could just think of a clever, word acronym, I'd be on my way. All right. Well, now we're going to look at Jabal Makla again. In verse 18, it talks about thunder, lightning, trumpet, smoking. And you can read the details there, but what's interesting is that in the book of Hebrews, it makes reference back to this. The writer says, "For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, and to a blazing fire, and to darkness and gloom and whirlwind, and to the blast of a trumpet and the sound of words. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem." But again, this is a type, but he's saying, as great and powerful as that was, we are in the Lord's church, and this is something even greater, even more powerful than that. In verses 24 to 26, God commanded them to make an altar of earth in every place they go for sacrificing burnt offerings and peace offerings. And interesting enough, any stones that were used, they had to be natural cut. They weren't supposed to be cut or chiseled. They just had to be natural stones. And I want to take a pause here to show, in many ways, you could say that Moses himself was a type of Christ. In Deuteronomy 18:15, Moses predicted to the Israelites that one day God would raise up a prophet like himself. And in the New Testament, you see there were ordinary people that sometimes would ask the question, well, is this man you're following here, this Jesus, is he the prophet that Moses was talking about? That's what they're asking. Well, here's some examples of how they were similar. Both were children of virgin women. Both were endangered in infancy. Both departed Egypt. In fact, you may recall when Jesus was a little baby and they escaped here, they went to Egypt, and Jesus came back. I believe there's a passage, possibly in Matthew, where it says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So it was fulfillment of that prophecy also. Both of them renounced power and wealth. Both were sent by God. Both were prophets, priests, and rulers. Moses was the leader of Israel. Both were rejected by their countrymen. I mean, think how many times Moses was criticized and rejected and really not appreciated by his countrymen. And many times Moses intervened or interceded on behalf of the Israelites, just like Jesus did for us. Both of them performed great miracles. In fact, even their first miracles were kind of similar. They both involved changing water to something else that was red. Moses' miracle was a miracle of judgment. Moses changed water into blood, but Jesus changed water into wine, which was more of a happy, kind of an optimistic, forward-looking miracle, celebrating this wedding and so on. Israel was baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea, according to 1 Corinthians 10:2. Spiritual Israel was baptized into Christ, Galatians 3:27. Moses gave to the people bread from heaven, Exodus 16:15. Christ gave the people loaves and fish in the wilderness. Plus, Jesus is a figure of him who is the bread of life. In John 6:31, John 6:49 and following, there's a reference to Jesus being the bread out of heaven, like the manna. Both were deliverers, lawgivers, and mediators. When the law came through Moses, 3,000 people perished. And that's going to happen in Exodus 32:28. 3,000 people perished. When the law came through Christ at Pentecost, 3,000 souls were saved. Both went up to a mountain, and both were transfigured. Both Moses and Jesus offered themselves to die for the people. Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. Christ was lifted up upon the cross, John 3:14. And I think Tim just made reference to that just a week or two ago. Moses was the mediator of the Old Testament. Jesus is mediator of the New Testament. Both were the subjects of a special interposition on the part of God when they died. Moses was buried by God in Deuteronomy 34:6, and Christ was raised from the dead, Mark 16:6. So from time to time, I'd like to make some comparisons. Later on, I'll probably make some comparisons between Aaron, the priest Aaron, and Jesus, and also the tabernacle and the church. Okay, 21. Well, now, like I said, a lot of people, they think about the Ten Commandments like that's the only thing God ever said about regulation, but there is a lot more than just the Ten Commandments. When I look at chapter 21, I would kind of sum it up almost like a Bill of Rights. And beginning in verse, I would say the following chapters detail laws regulating things like punishing offenses and in some case making restitution. In verses 1 through 11, we have ordinances for people, and there's a number of things I could talk about there, but I was kind of interested in this idea of slavery because I could see, I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but I can imagine people who have a hard time believing in the God of the Old Testament, they might come to this and have an issue with it. So I want to talk a little bit about that. In verse 2, it mentions slavery. Mentions Hebrews owning fellow Hebrews as slaves. Think about it. Hebrews owning fellow Hebrews as slaves. In preparation, in fact, if we go back to Exodus 12, it says, in preparation for the Passover, the instructions seem to anticipate the Israelites owning slaves in 1244. Now, they were slaves themselves. I don't know, but I just can't imagine them slaves owning slaves, other slaves. But maybe it's anticipating that there would be a day in the future where they would own slaves. And it may seem incongruous that the Hebrews, having just been delivered from the oppression of slavery, would themselves become slave owners. And because they knew how horrible and how awful it was to be a slave, at least under Egyptian slavery. Also, since God is a loving God and He's a just God, why would He permit such a practice among His holy people? Why would God not simply abolish slavery? Why would He not just say, you shall not have slaves? And so I don't know if you've ever wrestled with that. And obviously, only God knows the answer to that ultimately, but let me offer up some potential explanations, and it's maybe several things altogether. Well, first of all, one thing I think is really important to point out is that God did not command his people to practice slavery, nor to even seek out slaves. God did not say, I want you to have slaves, or here's how you need to go and find slaves. He never commanded that. Slavery was something already widely practiced in the pagan world. Slavery's been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's not any one invention of any culture. And just like idolatry and all the other bad practices crept in, eventually slavery crept in among the Hebrews. And I would compare it to divorce. God did not sanction divorce. That was not his plan. He doesn't like divorce. In fact, he hates divorce. But knowing people would do it, he regulated it. Look at Matthew 19:8. You may remember this discussion that Jesus had. He tells them, Moses, God, that wasn't God's plan originally, but he said, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted it or regulated it. And I think perhaps likewise, God knew that eventually these people would stoop down and start getting involved in slavery. It'd be hard to stop. So God at least put limitations on it that greatly reduced the horrors of it, knowing that the Hebrews would eventually adopt the practice. That's just what I believe. And I think that if you understand it, I think that makes it a bit more reasonable to accept this. Because I'm sure if you looked around the pagan world, slavery was probably a horrible thing. But if you look throughout the next chapters, several chapters here and there, there's regulations limiting slavery. And it's like if you had to be a slave, you'd want to be a Hebrew slave because they were treated much better than all the other people were. In the New Testament, think about this too. In the New Testament, neither Christ nor any of his apostles called for the outright abolition of slavery. Israel was under the rule of the Roman Empire, and there were people that wanted Jesus to start the rebellion. They remember that, who should we pay taxes to? They were always egging him on, trying to provoke him to try to throw off the Roman chains and so on. Jesus never, ever told them to rebel, to get angry, conflict, and fight against the Romans. Nor did he ever say to abolish slavery. And if you think about it, slavery was so widespread in the New Testament, it was so integrated to the economy. It's just something that you couldn't just snap your fingers and get rid of it overnight. However, the general teachings of Christianity set in motion forces that in time brought down the whole conception of slavery. Because if you think about it, if you look at others and you treat them the way you want to be treated, and you realize that you are all equal before God, there's neither slave nor free. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female. But we know there are, but the point is, we're all equal before God. And over time, I think if you really look at your heart, you cannot be a slave owner and a Christian. You realize that that's just incompatible. But it was that gentle persuasion rather than a violent overturning. Also, there were different levels of slavery. And again, I'm saying all this. I'm not saying slavery was a good thing at all. And I think we all agree it's a bad thing. But I think this was a step in the right direction. God was trying to make the Hebrews a special nation and trying to make them better, trying to make them above the pagan world. There are different levels of slavery. What we read about here seems to be actually a more benign form of slavery, more along the lines of maybe indentured servitude among Hebrews, almost like a contract, like maybe somebody's poor or they got into hard times. They could actually offer themselves, say, well, as a slave, they could say, well, look, I'm in debt, I'll work for you, and they would do a contract, like maybe I'll work for you for 6 years, and that'll pay off my debt. So it was like a more of a benign thing. And this is right now, it's dealing with Hebrew slaves. The problem of foreign slaves was dealt with later in Leviticus 25. We'll read more about that. So I hope that maybe that helps understand a little bit why God didn't abolish slavery, why he allowed it, but again, he put limits. There were certain things that he just, for whatever reason, he kind of allowed, he looked the other way. In fact, same thing with marriage. I mean, there were, I think there were Hebrews that had more than one wife, I believe, after this, and he allowed that. I mean, you see that with Solomon and all that, but eventually that's trouble. But God, for the moment, he permitted it. Well, we're going to move on now to the next one, chapter 22, dealing with, there's kind of like just a mixture of different rules in here, so it's kind of hard to sum up the entire chapter, but this one I would call mostly having to do with property rights. So, for example, if someone is caught stealing instead of jail, he pays back with interest. If a thief is caught while breaking and entering and is killed in the process, the homeowner is not charged with a crime. And this is the basis for your stand your ground laws that we have in the United States. Most of the U.S. states have adopted this principle. And I thought it was interesting. It's rooted back here in Exodus. If an accident or carelessness results in either damage to property or it results in injury or death to an animal, the guilty party must make restitution. So there's a provision, not necessarily being punished, but you have to pay somebody back with interest. And then there's various laws, mention some things that are capital offenses. It also provides protections for people. For example, verse 21, you shall not oppress a stranger nor torment him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Verse 22, you shall not oppress any widow or orphan. Verse 28 says, you shall not curse the rule of your people. And the Apostle Paul refers to this verse when speaking before the Sanhedrin in response to being accused of insulting the high priest in Acts 23:5. So over and over again in the New Testament, there's so many references to Exodus. Chapter 23 has various instructions. The first 9 verses just has various laws continued. Just too many for us to cover. But verse 10 through 13 I thought was interesting. Talks about the Sabbath and the land. It repeats the requirements for people and animals to rest on the Sabbath day. Similarly, the land is to be worked for 6 years, but left fallow in the 7th year. So it's like a sabbatical year. And the reason for this is given in verses 10 through 11. This allows the needy and field animals to eat what's left over. So already God is showing his compassion for humans, for people that are poor, and even for the animals, so they have something to eat. And then next Sunday when we come back, I'll never get as far as I think I'm going to get. Next Sunday, we won't get into this today, but this will be a preview. We're going to be talking about the 3 national feasts, when 3 times a year, once they get settled in the land, 3 times a year, all the Hebrew males are supposed to go to a place that God will designate, and they're going to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of the Harvest, and the Feast of the Ingathering. And so that's chapter 23. I hope you read ahead. And then looking ahead, we'll talk about chapter 24, people affirm their covenant to God. And then beginning in chapter 25, that's when we start reading about the beginnings of building the tabernacle, beginning with gathering the materials and the design and so on. All right, looking ahead to next Sunday. So thank you so much for coming this morning. I hope you come back next Sunday. Thank you.